I got married on a Friday. By the following Monday, my husband asked me to sign a document that could have landed me in federal prison. I didn't know it yet, but the most beautiful wedding of my life had been orchestrated by criminals. Every smile, every sweet word, every promise, it was all a lie. And the proof was hidden right inside our own home, in the hands of a woman who pretended to be invisible. But before we continue, make sure you're subscribed to the channel and let us know in the comments, where are you watching from? We love knowing how far our stories travel. My name is Rachel. I'm 35 years old, and I've worked in the administration office of a food distribution company for nearly 10 years. I've always been the type of person who double-checks everything before signing a dotted line. I spend my days surrounded by contracts, invoices, spreadsheets, and documents that have to balance down to the last penny. It's a job with zero glamour, but it demands constant attention, the kind that forms a habit over time. You start looking at everything in life, trying to find where the numbers don't add up, where the language is too vague, or where someone left a blank space on purpose. It's ironic, then, that I was the one who almost signed away my life with my eyes closed, inside my own husband's house, with his smile watching me from across the room. I met Caleb at a vendor meeting a little over a year ago. He was a partner in a logistics firm in Chicago, and he had a way of speaking that made any complex topic sound simple. He had a patience for listening that I'd never found in a man before. It wasn't love at first sight. It was something slower, more like trust being built brick by brick over weeks of late-night phone calls after work, unprompted coffees brought to my desk when I stayed late, and messages sent at the exact moment I needed to hear something encouraging. He never forced anything. He never made grand, sweeping promises. He showed up at the right time, in the right measure, as if he had a calibrated radar to know exactly what I needed without me saying a word. Today, I realized that wasn't sensitivity, it was technique. He was a man who had studied what I needed to hear and delivered it in the perfect dose so I would never have a reason to pull back. In 8 months, we were engaged. In 12, we were married. The ceremony was small, at a rustic farmhouse in upstate New York, with those golden string lights hanging between the trees that make everything look beautiful, even at night. The food was great, the music was soft, and my mom cried twice, once during the processional and once when we cut the cake. And my brother Logan, who's a detective with the NYPD and usually wears an expression like he's solving a puzzle in his head, hugged me on the way out with a genuine smile. He whispered that I truly deserved to be happy. I believed him. I believed it with every ounce of strength I had at that moment. During our first few days as newlyweds, we stayed at Caleb's family estate while our condo in the city was being finished. Just a matter of weeks, he'd said. It was a large, well-maintained house in Connecticut with a front lawn too perfectly manicured to look natural, and a long backyard that ended at a warehouse with a permanently locked gate. I never saw anyone enter or leave through that gate during the day. At night sometimes, I'd hear an engine humming back there, but when I mentioned it to Caleb, he said it was just the backup generator. I didn't ask again. My mother-in-law, Eleanor, was a woman of impeccable appearance, hair always done, clothes pressed even at home, a smile always ready at the right moment. But her smile never reached her eyes. It was a practiced expression, the kind people develop when they spend years needing to appear as something they aren't. She welcomed me with kindness, called me honey, and poured my coffee before I even sat down. But there was a subtle calculation in every gesture, as if every act of care was an investment, waiting for a return. My father-in-law, Arthur, hardly spoke to me directly. He observed. He asked short, pointed questions about my work with a precision that I read as the curiosity of a businessman interested in his daughter-in-law's life. Only later would I understand they were the questions of someone evaluating a part before fitting it into a very specific machine. And then there was Maria, the housekeeper, who had worked there for years. She was thin, with slow, careful movements, moving through the house as if trying not to occupy any space beyond what was strictly necessary. She didn't speak more than needed, didn't look up more than needed, and every time Eleanor called her name, she appeared so fast it seemed she'd been waiting right outside the door. My first impression of her was pity. I thought she was a woman who had been slowly broken by the coldness and demands of that family. A week later, I would realize I had read everything completely backward. On my third day of marriage, while having coffee alone in the kitchen before everyone else woke up, I noticed Maria looking at me differently. It wasn't curiosity or friendliness. It was something more urgent, more heavy with meaning, which she swallowed every time she heard footsteps in the hallway, like someone who has something to say and is patiently waiting for the moment it's safe to say it without anyone else listening. That same afternoon, Arthur called me into his home office. The room was large and dark despite the windows, with shelves full of binders organized by color and date. There was a new folder on the desk, and he pushed it toward me with a forced lightness. The tone of someone trying to make something significant seem trivial. He said they were internal company documents, a necessary formality, and since I understood administration so well, it would be much more practical for me to sign them now to speed up a regulatory process on a tight deadline. I took the folder, I opened it, and before my brain fully grasped what I was reading, something in me slammed on the brakes. The title of the documents was too vague, intentionally generic. The clauses, written in legalese that bordered on purposefully confusing, transferred responsibilities that weren't clearly defined. There were blank fields on pages that should have been completely filled out, and my name was already typed in several sections, not as a spouse or family member, but as the administrative and technical lead for operations I had never performed, in a company I had never been part of. I closed the folder slowly. I told him I needed to read it more carefully before signing anything. Arthur's face didn't change, but the silence that followed those words weighed as heavy as a vault door slamming shut in an empty hallway. Caleb, who had been leaning against the doorframe during the entire conversation, just looked down at the floor. I went upstairs to our room, using a headache as an excuse. I laid on the bed and stared at the ceiling for a long time. I tried to convince myself I was overreacting, that it was just standard corporate bureaucracy, that business families handle paperwork all the time, and I was taking something purely practical too personally. But the feeling wouldn't go away. It stayed there, small and persistent, like a grain of sand in your shoe that you try to ignore until you can't take another step without feeling the sting. At dinner that night, I watched each of them with completely different eyes. Eleanor served Caleb's plate before mine. Arthur asked questions about my job with a precision that felt rehearsed. How many people had access to contracts at my firm, if I had power of attorney for my employer, if my signature was on file at the bank? Isolated, they sounded like an interested father-in-law. Together, they were an interrogation disguised as family bonding. I went to bed earlier than everyone else, but I didn't sleep. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of pans and muffled voices coming from the kitchen. I tiptoed down, not out of shyness, but out of instinct, that impulse you get when you realize you need to observe before being observed. Maria was washing dishes with her back to the door. The kitchen was empty except for the two of us. The sun was still weak through the window. And then, without turning around, without any warning, she spoke in a voice so low I had to take 2 steps forward to be sure I wasn't imagining it. "You shouldn't sign anything that comes out of this house." I turned quickly to see if anyone had heard. The hallway was empty. She kept washing the dishes exactly as before, her hands moving calmly over the cups, as if those words had never left her mouth. I didn't have time to respond. Eleanor walked in the next second with a smile already fixed on her face, asking if I'd slept well and if I wanted eggs for breakfast. I spent that entire day carrying Maria's words like a weight in my chest. I tried to create an opportunity to talk to her alone. I'd go to the kitchen on any excuse, linger longer than necessary in the halls, stay nearby when she swept the patio. But it was as if the house wouldn't allow it to happen. There was always someone nearby, always a task calling her to another room the exact moment I approached. Only later did I understand it wasn't a coincidence. She was kept visible and busy at all times. as if they knew, on some level, that a woman with free time and privacy within those walls was dangerous. That afternoon, Caleb invited me for a walk in the backyard. It was the first time since the wedding we'd been alone for more than 10 minutes without family interruption. He held my hand, talked about trips we'd take once the condo was ready, the kids we'd have, how happy we'd be once the rush of the first few months of marriage passed. The words were beautiful and well chosen. But I listened with a different kind of attention, not to what he said, but to what he avoided. And I noticed that every future he described, without exception, ended at the same point. That life would get easier once I was fully integrated into the family, once I was part of the business, once I signed the papers and stopped overcomplicating simple things. The folder came back the next day, this time brought by Eleanor personally. She brought it to my room with a cup of tea and a gentle explanation. It was just a deadline issue. The accountant needed the document by the end of the week. Nothing major. She had a motherly smile while she spoke, and the teacup she brought was my favorite color, which I'd mentioned in passing weeks ago. Even that detail had been catalogued and used at the right moment. But I had already learned not to look at the smile. I looked at her eyes, and her eyes were calculating. I asked for one more day. I said I wanted to reread it carefully. That night, I locked the bathroom door with the shower running and photographed every single page of those documents with my phone. I didn't know exactly what I was doing. There was no clear plan, just the instinct to save it before the folder disappeared or was replaced by a version harder to question. When I came out of the bathroom, Caleb was lying on the bed with his phone in his face. He didn't ask anything, but there was something about his posture, too rigid, too still for someone truly resting, that told me he'd noticed how long I'd been in there. In the middle of the night, I went to the kitchen to get a glass of water and found Maria sitting at the table in the dark, her hands folded over the checkered tablecloth, like someone who isn't waiting for sleep. She was waiting for a person. When she saw me enter, she slid a small object toward me without saying a word. An old USB drive, worn down like it had been used a lot, with a tiny label on the side I couldn't read in the dim light. Everything you need to know is on here. If you ever have the courage to use it all at once. Don't do it halfway. If you do, it's no good. I took it without asking. I tucked it into my bra and went back to the room without making a sound. Stepping on the parts of the floorboards I'd already learned didn't creak. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in the dark next to my husband of 1 week, with a thumb drive hidden against my chest, and the certainty growing slowly inside me that every smile in that house, every gesture of welcome, every word of affection had been rehearsed long before I ever showed up. I had arrived already expected, but not as a daughter-in-law, as a tool. Early in the morning, while the house was still asleep, I emailed the photos of the documents to my personal account and deleted them from my phone. Then I went to the bathroom, turned on the faucet, and called Logan. My brother answered on the second ring. I didn't need many words. I described the documents, the blank fields, my name typed as the legal representative for operations I'd never touched. He was silent for a few seconds that felt much longer than they were. Anyone who knows Logan knows that specific silence is the worst possible sign, because it means he's processing something that confirms a suspicion he wished he didn't have. When he finally spoke, he just told me not to sign absolutely anything, that he was going to check their company's EIN, and that he'd call me as soon as he had something concrete. I hung up with cold hands and a heart racing at a speed I pretended I couldn't feel. I waited until Caleb left that morning to open the thumb drive. I used my personal laptop, using my phone's mobile hotspot instead of the house Wi-Fi. Years in administration taught me that home networks keep access logs, and I couldn't afford to be careless now. What was on that drive made me stop breathing for a moment. The files were organized with a precision that wasn't amateur. There was a clear logic behind every folder, every file name, every date recorded. There were spreadsheets with double-entry bookkeeping where the real numbers were completely different from the ones on official documents. Photos of the warehouse behind the house showed boxes of unbranded products being opened, repackaged, and sealed with labels of well-known, respected brands. There were copies of invoices with altered amounts, records of transactions that didn't exist in any official filing. And at the bottom of one folder, a plain text file, no title, no header, with names, dates, and amounts that looked like records of kickbacks, the kind of log someone keeps when they need to remember who got paid what and when. It took me almost 2 hours to go through it all carefully. When I finished, I closed the laptop slowly and went to the window. The garden outside looked absolutely normal. The flowers in the beds, the black iron gate, Arthur's car parked on the side like every other day. Everything was the same. But I couldn't look at anything in that house and see what I saw before. It's like when you discover a wall that always looked solid is rotting from the inside. Once you know, you can't walk past it without thinking about what's hidden behind the paint. Maria wasn't just a housekeeper. That thumb drive wasn't a resentful employee's revenge. It was professional work. Someone had placed that woman there on purpose to document, with patience and precision, what was happening inside those walls over time. And she had chosen me to receive it. I needed to understand why. That same day, before lunch, I went to Arthur's office and handed back the folder. With all the calm I could muster, I said I'd read it carefully and that there were clauses that weren't clear enough for me. I told him that before signing anything, I needed independent legal counsel, an attorney I chose myself. The silence that followed lasted maybe 5 seconds. 5 seconds in which the charm of the successful businessman washed off Arthur's face like paint in the rain. What was left underneath was hard, unlayered, and vaguely threatening. He said there was no need for that they were simple documents, that I was overcomplicating a family formality, and that an outside lawyer would be expensive and take longer than the deadline allowed. Every argument tried to block a different exit. I responded calmly that I still preferred a second opinion before putting my signature on anything. That afternoon, Caleb tried to talk to me in our room. He used a gentle tone, open hands, the look of a worried husband. But the words he chose told me more than he intended. He said I was suspicious of his family for no reason, that it was very hurtful, and that an outside lawyer would be slow and unnecessary. Every argument was a nudge to get me back to that signature. This wasn't a man worried about his marriage or his wife. This was someone worried about a deadline and a plan that was starting to go off script. That night, I called Logan from inside the bathroom with the shower on, speaking low with my hand over the phone. When I finished describing the drive, I heard him exhale slowly, the kind of breath someone takes when they're absorbing information that changes the scale of the problem. After a pause, he said he needed to see it in person, that depending on what was there was a specific protocol to follow, and doing it wrong could compromise everything. We agreed I'd leave the house the next morning when Caleb and his father usually left for the office together. No notice, just the bare essentials in a backpack. I hung up, wiped my face, and looked in the mirror for a moment longer than usual. I had arrived at this house as a bride, with flowers in my hair, believing every word I'd heard for the last 12 months. I would leave as a witness to a crime that almost had my name attached to it. I left on a Tuesday morning with a small backpack and a level of control over my own breathing I didn't know I had until I needed it. I packed only the basics: ID, the thumb drive, my charger, clothes for 2 days. Everything that proved I was me and everything that proved they were them. Eleanor was in the living room when I came down. I told her I was going to the pharmacy and would be back soon. She didn't ask anything other than if I needed her to pick up anything else. I said, "No, thank you," and walked out the front door with normal steps, no rush, without looking around. I didn't look back when I closed the gate, not because it was easy, but because I knew if I did, they'd see hesitation, and hesitation was the one thing I couldn't afford to show. Logan was waiting for me at a Starbucks a few blocks away, sitting at a back table with a coffee he hadn't even touched. When I sat down and opened the laptop, he scrolled through the files in silence, reading with that specific focus of someone looking not just for what's written, but for what's being hidden. I've known my brother for 35 years. I know every flicker of his expression. What I saw wasn't surprise. It was recognition. It was the face of someone seeing concrete proof of something he'd already suspected, which made him colder, not more agitated. When he finished, he closed the laptop and told me what he'd found over the last few days. Caleb's company, EIN, had been flagged 2 years ago on suspicion of money laundering, but the case had been dropped due to a lack of internal evidence. Maria's thumb drive was exactly what that investigation had failed to get: inside evidence with dates, values, physical logs, and the adulteration process documented in photos. With this, the case could be reopened with a much stronger foundation. It hit me in a way I didn't expect. This wasn't some improvised scheme thrown together after I joined the family. This was built with layers over time, with escape routes planned in advance for the moment someone started asking questions. And I had been recruited, without knowing it, to be one of those routes: the clean name, the administrative background, the experience with legal documents, the signature of someone outside the family who would, on paper, take all the heat while they stayed protected in the shadows. We went to the precinct that same afternoon. I sat in a hard plastic chair in front of a metal desk with the laptop open and showed everything to a detective who initially looked at me with the standard expression of someone who's heard too many stories. But when we got to the warehouse files, the photos of products being tampered with, the spreadsheets with 2 sets of numbers, he stopped writing. He called a colleague, then another. The room got crowded without anyone announcing they were coming in. I stayed there as they went back and forth with questions, making copies, talking in low tones to each other. At some point, someone brought me a cup of water. I held it without drinking, because my throat was too tight for anything but answering questions. My phone started vibrating around 3 in the afternoon. Caleb, then Eleanor, then an unknown number that called 3 times in a row. I didn't answer any of them. At 4, a text came from Caleb, short and without punctuation. "Where are you?" I didn't reply. And in that deliberate silence, the silence of not answering when I'd always replied within minutes, I felt a door close for good, the kind that doesn't open from the inside again. We left the precinct when the sun was low and the air had that specific late afternoon chill that always makes me think of home. I went to my mom's house. She opened the door without asking anything except if I'd eaten. When I said no, she heated up some food in silence and put it in front of me. I ate alone at the kitchen table where I'd grown up, staring at the wall with the same local market calendar, trying to understand how a whole year of a life could be fabricated with such precision, such patience, and such a cold heart. That night, I cried. Not out of sadness for the man or the marriage. I cried for the version of me that had believed in all of it with total sincerity. For being so careful with work contracts and so careless with the most important contract I'd ever signed, the one of the heart. The following days had a strange texture that's hard to explain if you haven't been through it. Life on the outside continued identically. The traffic, the work, the messages from co-workers asking how the honeymoon phase was going, if I was happy, if the in-laws were nice. And I replied normally, saying I was adjusting, that I was fine, while inside I was at the center of something that didn't have a name yet and took up all the space I had. Caleb tried to contact me every day that week. At first, the messages sounded like a worried husband. "We need to talk, call me when you can, I love you," words that, at any other time, would have touched me. Then they got shorter, colder, fewer pronouns and more commands, until at a certain point, they stopped being about us and became about the documents. If I still had the folder, what I'd done with it, if I'd shown it to anyone, if I'd made copies. Those messages were, without him intending it, the clearest confession I could have received. Because a man who loved his wife and was genuinely worried about his marriage wouldn't ask about a folder of paperwork. He'd ask if she was okay, He'd ask where she was sleeping. He'd ask if she'd eaten. But no, what mattered to him was what I knew and who I'd talked to. I forwarded every message to Logan, who told me to save them without replying. Every saved message was evidence. Every silence on my part was strategy. On Thursday of that week, Maria called me from a different number I didn't recognize. Her voice was calm, but there was a specific relief in it. The relief of someone who can finally speak without lowering their voice, without monitoring who's outside the door. She told me what I'd already started to suspect. She wasn't a housekeeper. She worked for an independent investigative firm hired by a trade association tracking fraud in the food supply chain. Months earlier, a batch of contaminated products with forged labels had made children sick in 2 different cities. No one had died, but the risk had been real, documented, and covered up. The trail of that product, after a long and difficult investigation, had led to Caleb's family business. She had entered that house as a housekeeper to get what outside investigators couldn't get any other way. Access to the original physical documents, the real conversations inside the house, what actually happened in the warehouse after the gate closed. She'd stayed for nearly a year. She'd swallowed insults, unnecessary orders, and the strategic invisibility of someone who needs to seem like less than they are to see more than others show. When she finished talking, I was silent for a while. Then I asked why she had given the drive to me instead of directly to her bosses or the authorities. She said she'd tried to use the material before, but without an inside witness. Someone who could confirm they had received documents to sign had been pressured to do so and had refused. The material could be contested by a defense team. The family had expensive lawyers and enough resources to drag out any trial. She needed me not just as a source of evidence, but as living proof of their attempt to use my name. I hung up with a mix of feelings I couldn't name. Outrage for being chosen without knowing. Gratitude for holding on to the instinct not to sign. And something like awe at realizing how a single decision made by pure instinct on a random afternoon had changed everything. That same week, investigators raided the warehouse. Logan told me that night, his voice tense but controlled, using short words the way he does when he's managing his adrenaline. They found exactly what the photos on the drive showed, unverified products being repackaged. And they also found a second complete set of ledgers, hidden behind a shelf in the back of Arthur's office, with the real numbers that had never made it onto any official report. The arrest warrants were issued 2 days later. I went there the day the police arrived. Logan didn't want me to. He said I didn't need to be there, that I'd already done my part, that the rest was their job. But I needed to see. Not for revenge. And I asked myself several times on the way if there was another name for what I was feeling. But the honest answer was that I needed to see with my own eyes that it was real, that it wasn't a nightmare I was still trying to wake up from, that the people who had smiled at me at my wedding were the same ones who had planned to make me their fall guy. I arrived when the cruisers were already parked in front of the gate. I stayed on the sidewalk next to Logan, who was in plain clothes. The street was quiet that time of morning, and the contrast between the normal garden and the police presence created a scene that looked like it was out of a movie. Except it was real, and I was in the middle of it. Eleanor came out first. Still in her pajamas, her hair tied up in a rush, and for the first time in the whole time I'd known her, the smile was completely gone. In its place was panic trying to disguise itself as indignation. She spoke to the officers in an authoritative tone, as if this were a misunderstanding that could be resolved with the right voice and posture, as if her whole life had been an environment where she could control outcomes with the authority of someone used to never being contradicted. But it wasn't that environment anymore, and she hadn't fully understood that yet. Arthur came out next, more contained, in a suit even at that hour, like someone who had prepared to be seen, knew he would be seen, and had decided that appearance was the last thing he still had control over. But when the officers presented the warrant and began reading it aloud, I saw something break in him, not in his face. He controlled his face until the end. It was in his shoulders. A small, almost imperceptible sag of someone realizing there was no exit through the front door. Caleb came out last. He saw me before he reached the gate. He stopped for a second with his eyes locked on mine, and in that moment, I understood what he was waiting for me to look away, for me to show a sign of guilt, for me to look regretful for leaving, for there to be some piece of me he could still use. But I didn't look away. I looked at him directly, without anger and without pity, with the same attention I learned to give to documents that need to be read to the very last line. And that seemed to scare him in a way no words could have. Maria was also there, by my side. It was the first time I'd seen her outside that house, in normal clothes, with an open face and the posture of someone who no longer needs to pretend they take up less space than they do. She looked like a different person. Or maybe, for the first time in a long time, she could be who she really was. When the cruisers left and the sound of the engines faded, a strange silence settled. A few neighbors watched from their windows with that look of people wanting to understand without being seen understanding. The house's garden was still there, with the same flowers and the same black gate, the same appearance of an organized, respectable family. But now it was just a facade, a shell with nothing inside to hold up the weight it had carried for years. 2 weeks later, I filed for divorce. I sat in front of a lawyer my mom had recommended and signed every page with a clarity I didn't expect to feel. My hand didn't shake, because that signature was completely different from all the ones I'd almost given before. It wasn't a surrender. It was a closure. It wasn't a loss. It was a decision made consciously, by me, for me, without anyone pushing or pressuring me. The process moved forward. Caleb was indicted, among other crimes, for attempted identity fraud and use of third-party documents. The messages he'd sent asking me to sign and later asking me to destroy the copies had become direct evidence. Every message I'd saved in silence while he waited for a reply. Every silence of mine that he'd read as weakness had revealed itself, in fact, as an archive. I won't lie and say it was easy afterward. It wasn't. And pretending it was would be dishonest to anyone hearing this story. There were mornings when I'd wake up in my mom's guest room, the same room I'd slept in when I was 16, with the same fan in the corner and the same water stain on the ceiling no one had ever fixed, and I'd just stare at the ceiling for a while before I could get up. It wasn't sadness for the man. It was something more diffuse, like the exhaustion of someone who's carried something very heavy for a long time and only realizes how much it weighed after they finally let go. The body takes time to understand it can let go. There were days when I'd catch myself replaying everything, every conversation, every dinner, every detail that had passed me by without me recognizing it for what it was. Caleb bringing me coffee at work. The first time he introduced me to his family. The way Eleanor had taken my hand at that first meeting and said I looked like a girl from a good family. I'd replay it all and try to find the exact moment I could have realized. But the truth is, they were good. They weren't careless. They were professionals at deception, with years of practice and a method that had worked before me and would have worked on me if I'd signed that first day. People asked questions. Co-workers, old friends, cousins who had been at the wedding in pretty dresses and cheered for us, each with the version of the story that had reached them, some incomplete, some with swapped details, some that made me either a fragile victim or a brave woman, as if there were only 2 roles available. I let each person keep the version that fit their view. The complete truth was mine. I didn't owe an explanation to anyone but myself. I went back to work 3 weeks later. My desk was in the same spot. The pile of contracts was still waiting. The routine was identical on the outside. But I wasn't the same person who had left to get married. I sat in that chair and looked over the documents with a level of attention I used to reserve for exceptions. Now everything was treated with the same care. Not out of paranoia, but because I'd learned, in the most direct way possible, that the attention we don't give ourselves is the gap others use to enter without asking. Maria went to another city as part of a protection protocol. Before she left, She came to my mom's house to say goodbye. The three of us had coffee on the porch, with the afternoon sun hitting the side of the house and the street quiet below. She told me she'd gone into that house expecting to stay a few months, and stayed nearly a year, because the scheme was more branched and careful than it initially seemed. She said that when I arrived, she knew her time was up, because if I signed those documents, the trail would be covered with my name on top, and the investigation would be lost. It took me a few seconds to process the real weight of that my refusal, that no said in silence, that folder closed and returned without drama on an ordinary afternoon, had preserved months of investigative work and stopped people from continuing to be harmed by tampered products. That a gesture made by pure instinct, without me knowing the stakes, had been decisive in a way I could never have measured at the time. Today, when I look at that period with the distance time provides, the word that feels most honest isn't trauma or victory. It's learning, the kind that hurts while it's happening, that you wouldn't choose to repeat, but that changes something permanent in the way you move through the world afterward. I learned that documents with blank fields are never a formality. I learned that a rush to sign is a red flag, always, without exception. I learned that people who want to distance you from your work, your independence, and the people who truly know you don't do it for love. They do it because they need someone inside the scheme who looks, from the outside, like they're there by choice. I learned that kindness that comes in the exact dose, at the exact moment, without ever missing a beat, deserves extra attention, because spontaneous kindness stumbles, runs late, and sometimes gets the dose wrong. The kind that never fails was practiced. And I learned that instinct isn't overreacting. That first weird feeling holding the folder in Arthur's office. That thread of discomfort I almost ignored because it seemed too small to be taken seriously. That look from Maria that I decided not to dismiss. All of it was real. It was my own alarm system working before my brain had the vocabulary to name the danger. I keep that old thumb drive in my desk drawer. Not to relive the pain or nurture anger. The anger is gone. It left on its own with time. I keep it because it reminds me that in that moment, when everything seemed rigged against me, there was a woman who had risked months of her own safety to gather proof with patience and courage, and who, in a moment of silence in a dark kitchen, had decided to trust me before I even knew who to trust. I honored that trust, and that, in a way, matters more than anything I could have done differently along the way. Sometimes, when the day has been too long and the tiredness is the kind that doesn't go away with a night's sleep, I open the drawer and look at it for a moment. And I remind myself that at the exact moment I had to choose, to sign or not to sign, to stay or to go, to trust my instinct or yield to the pressure of people telling me I was overcomplicating something simple. I chose myself. That marriage had been built on lies, chosen with care, and executed with precision. But the decision to leave was entirely mine. And that is something no one can ever take away. Now, if you liked this story, click subscribe and tell me in the comments. Which part left you speechless? Oh, and don't forget to become a member for access to exclusive videos I don't post here. I'll see you there.